Grandpa's question came quietly from his chair by the window. Did they really sell it? I nodded. Yes, they sold it. Dad sold the Hamilton watch Grandpa had promised me before my first appointment, the one I kept safe in its original case at Grandpa's house, the one that was supposed to be mine. The money went to help buy Mia a car while I was stationed near Ramstein in Germany. $15,000. Grandpa stayed quiet for a long moment, his thumb already scrolling through contacts. One tap. Then he looked up at me and said, "It's time they met my lawyer." I wish I could say it began there, but it started weeks earlier. I'm Ava, I'm 31, and I've served nearly 9 years as a U.S. Army medic. When this story begins, I was stationed in Germany near Ramstein Air Base, doing what I'd trained to do: stabilize trauma patients, run medical response drills, coordinate evacuations, patch people up, and keep them steady when everything else was falling apart. The military gave me something I'd needed for a long time: structure that didn't bend based on someone's mood, accountability that applied to everyone equally. A place where your effort mattered and promises weren't negotiable or subject to reinterpretation later. Home had always been more complicated. My mom died when I was younger. The grief carved out space in our house that never really filled back in, just stayed there like an empty room nobody wanted to talk about. Dad remarried when I was 16. His new wife came with expectations about what family should look like: tidy, presentable, centered around her daughter. My half-sister Mia became the focus of everything almost immediately. She was celebrated for small achievements, protected from consequences, praised for the smallest things. Meanwhile, I was told I was strong, independent, mature for my age, that I didn't need as much attention or validation. So I stopped asking for much, and eventually I stopped expecting much either. That's how it works sometimes in families that are trying to blend but never quite do. You get labeled early, and the label becomes the excuse for everything that follows. Strong meant self-sufficient. Self-sufficient meant invisible. Invisible meant I could be overlooked, forgotten about, left out of decisions, and nobody had to feel bad about it because I was fine. I was always fine. Dad checked in occasionally, the way you check a box on a to-do list. Quick phone calls on birthdays or holidays, asking surface-level questions and not waiting long for the answers. Grandpa checked in like it actually mattered to him how I was doing. He called every few weeks, asked real questions about my life, listened to the answers, remembered details from previous conversations. He didn't treat my choice to serve in the military as abandonment or rebellion or proof that I was running away from something. He treated it as what it was: a decision to build something solid in my own life, something that couldn't be reshaped by other people's disappointment or bent to fit their convenience. The watch was part of that. It was a 1940s Hamilton, something Grandpa had worn almost every day for decades. He'd bought it after the war with money he saved working extra shifts at the rail yard. It wasn't flashy, no gold plating, no precious stones, just brushed steel and clean lines. But it was his. The crystal had tiny scratches from years of use, little marks that told stories I'd never know. The leather strap had been replaced twice over the decades, but the mechanism inside still kept perfect time, ticking with the same steady precision it had when it was new. He tied the watch to more than just hours and minutes. He tied it to showing up when you said you would, to keeping your word even when it cost you something, to the idea that time is the one thing you can't get back or remake, so how you spend it and who you spend it with matters. Before my first overseas assignment, he placed it in my hand and told me it would be mine someday. We were standing in his kitchen on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of ordinary moment that becomes significant only in hindsight. Sunlight was coming through the window over the sink. Dad was there too, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, watching the interaction but not saying much. Grandpa wrapped my fingers around the watch, closed my hand over it gently, and said, "This is earned time. You've earned it." I remember feeling the weight of it in my palm, heavier than I expected, warm from his wrist. I didn't wear it after that. I didn't want to risk losing it overseas or having it damaged in the field. Combat medics don't exactly work in controlled environments. I kept it wrapped in the same faded handkerchief Grandpa had used for storage, tucked inside its original case, a small leather box with a velvet interior that had worn smooth over the years. I stored it in Grandpa's nightstand drawer, in his room, where I knew it would be safe, waiting for the day I'd be ready to carry it the way he had, with the weight of what it meant. That was the arrangement. Grandpa knew where it was, I knew it was secure, and Dad knew it wasn't his. Then, one afternoon in Germany, I got a call. Dad's voice had that careful brightness people use when they're hoping you won't ask too many questions. He mentioned that Mia had finally got the car she wanted. He sounded proud, almost giddy. I asked what kind of car. He stayed vague, said something about a European import, something special, something she'd been eyeing for months. I didn't push it then. I told myself it wasn't my business what they did with their money. A few days later, I saw the post. Mia standing next to a dark blue luxury sedan, arms crossed, smiling like she'd just won something. The paint looked flawless, the kind of finish that catches light in a specific way. The caption said, "New Beginnings." Comments piled up underneath, congratulations, heart emojis, people saying she deserved it, asking what model it was, saying they were jealous. I stared at that photo longer than I should have. Mia didn't have the kind of income that would cover a car like that. She'd worked part-time retail jobs, nothing steady, nothing that would build the kind of credit or savings you'd need for this. Dad was usually tight with money, the kind of person who'd argue over a dinner bill or compare gas prices across 3 stations before filling up. But here he was, celebrating something expensive and calling it deserved. The numbers didn't add up. The timing didn't add up. I called again, asked where the money came from. Dad shut me down fast, said Mia deserved something nice, said she'd been through a lot, and this was a way to help her start fresh. Then he added the line that's always been his favorite, "You wouldn't understand. You're not here." That phrase had been his go-to for years. It was the conversation ender, the boundary he drew whenever I questioned anything. "You're not here. You don't see the whole picture. You don't get a vote." I hung up feeling that familiar weight in my chest, half anger, half resignation. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself to let it go. Then, a few weeks later, I got word that Grandpa had a fall. Nothing catastrophic according to the initial report, but enough that he needed longer-term care and supervision. The nursing home staff said he was stable, alert, and asking for family. I requested emergency leave through my chain of command and flew home as soon as the paperwork cleared. The flight felt longer than usual. I kept running through scenarios in my head, what I'd say, how I'd help, what arrangements might need to be made. I didn't let myself think about the watch. That felt selfish, worrying about an object when Grandpa's health was the real concern. I went straight to the nursing home from the airport, my duffel bag still in the rental car. Grandpa looked smaller than I remembered, his frame thinner under the hospital-style blanket, but his eyes were still sharp when I walked in. He was sitting up in the adjustable bed, and when he saw me, he smiled in that quiet way he had, relieved but not surprised, like he'd known I'd come but was glad to have it confirmed. We talked for a while, small things at first, safe things, how the flight was, whether the nursing staff was treating him well, how long my leave would last. He asked about Germany, about my unit, about whether I was eating enough. Normal Grandpa questions. Then, almost without thinking, I glanced at the nightstand beside his bed. The top drawer was slightly open. I reached over and pulled it the rest of the way. Empty. The faded handkerchief was gone. The original watch case was gone. The watch was gone. I stared at the empty space for a long moment, my mind trying to catch up with what I was seeing. Maybe he'd moved it. Maybe the staff had put it somewhere safer. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. I asked one of the nurses at the station if Grandpa had requested anything be moved or stored elsewhere. She was kind, patient, the way good nurses are. She checked her notes, scrolled through the digital log on her tablet, and said no, nothing had been logged. No family members had signed anything out. As far as the record showed, nothing had been removed from his room. I thanked her and went back. Dad showed up about an hour later, walking in like he owned the space, carrying a small bag of items he said Grandpa might need: toiletries, a change of clothes, a book. I waited until he'd set everything down, waited until Grandpa had dozed off in his chair, and then I asked him directly, quietly, where the watch was. He deflected immediately, said they'd taken care of some things during the transition, that I didn't need to worry about logistics, that everything was handled. I pressed, asked what taken care of meant. He pivoted to authority, the way he always did when cornered. Told me I wasn't here, that adult decisions had to be made while I was overseas, that I didn't understand the full picture or the urgency of the situation. I felt the dread settle in my stomach like a stone, heavy and cold. The next morning, I confronted him again in the hallway outside Grandpa's room. The space was narrow, fluorescent lit, the kind of institutional corridor that makes private conversations feel exposed. Dad was coming back from the cafeteria with a cup of coffee when I stopped him. I asked him again where the watch was. He framed it as liquidity, said it was a practical decision, that the car opened doors for Mia, gave her opportunities she wouldn't have otherwise. Said the watch was just sitting there, that Grandpa wasn't using it, that I wasn't coming back for it anytime soon anyway. I told him it wasn't his to sell. He looked at me like I'd said something cruel, like I was the one being unreasonable. Then he shifted tactics, softened his voice, said Grandpa was fragile, that his health wasn't great, that stress could make things worse. He said if I upset him by bringing this up, if something happened because of it, that would be on me. He said it gently, almost kindly, but the threat was clear. It was the guilt card, played straight. And it was effective because part of me believed it. That night, alone in my hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed and felt the weight of it pressing down. The room was generic, beige walls, thin curtains, a bedspread that smelled faintly of detergent. Part of me wanted to keep quiet to protect Grandpa from the disappointment, to avoid the confrontation that felt inevitable if I told the truth. Part of me wanted to believe that Dad was right, that I was making too much of this, that silence was the loving thing to do. But I kept coming back to the same question: who was I really protecting? Not Grandpa. He deserved to know what had been done with something he'd promised me, something he valued. Not myself. Silence wasn't keeping me safe. It was just keeping me complicit. I prayed. Not for a miracle, not for everything to be fixed overnight. I prayed for steadiness, for clean motives. I asked God to help me tell the truth without spite, to have courage without chaos. Proverbs 35:6 kept coming back to me. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. I wasn't leaning on my anger. I was leaning on what was right. Silence hadn't protected anyone. It had only made room for this. I decided to tell Grandpa. I went back early the next morning. The nursing home was quiet, pale light coming through the windows. The hallway smelled like institutional breakfast oatmeal and weak coffee, and the only sounds were the soft beeping of monitors from other rooms. Grandpa was awake, sitting in his chair near the window, watching the day start. Before I spoke, I asked God for the ability to stay calm and say only what was true. Then I told him. Dad sold the watch. Grandpa didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He just asked, quietly, how much. I said most of it went toward a very expensive car for Mia. I told him the full amount, $15,000. I told him about the social media post, about Dad's evasiveness, about the way he'd framed it as liquidity and necessity. Grandpa nodded slowly, like a piece of a puzzle had just locked into place. Then he asked if Dad had told me himself. I said yes, in a hallway yesterday, framed as an adult decision that had to be made while I was overseas. Grandpa looked out the window for a long moment. I couldn't tell if he was angry or disappointed or just processing. Then he said, I kept it simple for a reason. I asked what he meant. He said he'd set up a small family trust years ago. Nothing complicated, no maze of legal clauses or offshore accounts. Just a straightforward legal structure to make sure a few key things: his house, some savings, the watch, went where they were supposed to go when the time came. He'd listed Dad as a co-trustee because he thought it would teach him responsibility, give him a role that meant something. Grandpa's voice didn't shake. He said selling something held in trust without authorization wasn't just wrong, it was potentially illegal. It was a breach of fiduciary duty, a violation of the legal arrangement Dad had agreed to when he signed the trust documents. I didn't know what to say. I hadn't realized the watch was part of something formal. I thought it was just a family promise, the kind of thing that didn't have legal weight. Grandpa pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and made one call. The conversation was brief. He said a name, Thomas Hayes, a state attorney, and asked if Thomas was still taking calls. Apparently he was. Grandpa scheduled a meeting for later that week, thanked him, and hung up. When he looked back at me, there was something steady in his expression, something resolved. He said, "It's time they met my lawyer." A few days later, I sat across from Thomas in his office downtown. The space was quiet, organized, the kind of place where documents mattered more than dramatics. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with legal volumes and binders. A window looked out over the street, but the blinds were angled to keep the light from being too harsh. Thomas was in his 60s, calm and methodical, the kind of person who'd seen enough family disputes to know that most of them followed predictable patterns. He asked direct questions and took notes in neat handwriting on a yellow legal pad without flinching. I walked him through everything. The promise Grandpa made before my deployment, the exact words he used when he handed me the watch, the storage arrangement, where it was kept, why I didn't take it overseas, the car Mia got, the social media post that first made me suspicious, the empty drawer at the nursing home, Dad's deflection and guilt tactics. Thomas asked if I had proof of the promise. I said Dad was standing right there when Grandpa gave it to me. Thomas made a note. Asked if there was a paper trail for the sale. I said I didn't know for certain, but I assumed there had to be receipts, bank transfers, something that would show money changing hands. He leaned back in his chair and explained the structure of the trust. Grandpa had put certain assets under legal protection. The watch was specifically listed in the trust documents along with the house and a portion of his savings. Selling a trust asset required both trustees to agree, and even then, the proceeds were supposed to stay within the trust unless there was documented need, medical expenses, property maintenance, things like that. Personal purchases for family members didn't qualify. None of that had happened. Thomas said this wasn't just a family disagreement about fairness or hurt feelings. It was a breach of fiduciary duty. If we pursued it, there would be documentation requests, possible restitution demands, and legal leverage to ensure compliance going forward. He asked what I wanted. I said I wanted the truth acknowledged. I wanted the watch back if possible, or the money restored to where it was supposed to be. And I wanted to make sure this didn't happen again, that there were guardrails in place so Dad couldn't make these kinds of decisions without oversight. Thomas nodded. He said he'd send a formal letter requesting full documentation of the sale, when it happened, who bought it, how much it sold for, where the money went. He'd also set a meeting date and make it clear that cooperation was expected. He told me to be prepared for pushback. People don't always respond well when consequences arrive, especially when they've convinced themselves they did nothing wrong. I thanked him and left. The letter went out 2 days later. Thomas sent me a copy by email. It was formal, precise, unemotional. It outlined the trust structure, the specific asset in question, the unauthorized sale, and the legal obligation to provide full documentation. It requested a meeting within 10 business days. It was the kind of letter that doesn't leave room for misunderstanding. Dad called me that night. His voice was tight and controlled, the way it gets when he's trying very hard not to yell. He said I was making this bigger than it needed to be, that I was embarrassing the family, that people would talk, that this would become public, that Grandpa didn't need the stress of lawyers and formal meetings. I told him Grandpa already knew. I told him Grandpa was the one who called the lawyer. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Dad said I didn't understand what I was doing, that I was burning bridges, that some things can't be undone. I said some things shouldn't be undone, that the watch wasn't his to sell, and that bringing a lawyer into it wasn't my choice, it was his. He could have told me the truth when I first asked. He could have returned the money quietly. He could have admitted the mistake. He chose not to. He hung up. Mia didn't call. She didn't text. She didn't reach out at all. Their stepmother sent one text message a few hours later. It said, "Is this really necessary?" I didn't reply. The question answered itself. The meeting was set for the following week at Thomas's office. I flew back for it, landing the night before and checking into the same hotel where I'd spent that night praying for steadiness. Grandpa didn't attend. Thomas had advised him to stay out of the room to avoid any claims of undue influence or coercion. The law worked better, he explained, when the protected party remained protected, not pulled into the negotiations. It would just be me, Thomas, Dad, and his wife. The morning of the meeting, I woke up earlier than I needed to. I felt the nerves kicking in, not the kind that come from doubt, but the kind that come from knowing you're about to do something that can't be undone. This wasn't a conversation anymore. This was a line being drawn in permanent ink, the kind that doesn't fade even if you wish it would later. I prayed again before I went in. I sat in the hotel room with a cup of bad coffee and asked God to help me speak the truth without turning it into a weapon. Ephesians 4:15 had been on my mind all week, speaking the truth in love. The two aren't opposites. They're supposed to work together. I wasn't there to punish anyone or make Dad feel small. I was there to stand up for what was right without tearing anyone down in the process. The meeting room was small and sterile. White walls, a long conference table with 6 chairs, no windows, the kind of space designed for uncomfortable conversations. Thomas sat at the head of the table with a folder in front of him, neatly labeled and organized the way lawyers organize things. I sat next to him, my hands folded on the table in front of me to keep them from shaking. Dad and his wife sat across from us, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. His wife kept glancing at the door like she was calculating how quickly she could leave. Dad kept his eyes on the table, his jaw set. Thomas started with the facts. He didn't raise his voice or add editorial commentary, he just laid it out. The trust structure, what it was, when it was established, what assets it covered, Dad's role as co-trustee and the responsibilities that came with it, the watch as a specifically listed asset with documented provenance and value. Then he asked Dad directly if he'd sold the watch. Dad admitted it. His voice was flat, almost defensive, like he was confessing to something minor. He said it was a liquidity issue, that there had been unexpected expenses, that he thought Grandpa wouldn't mind since the watch was just sitting there unused. Thomas didn't react. He just made a note and asked if Dad had documented the sale or consulted the trust terms before proceeding. Dad said no. Thomas asked where the money went. Dad hesitated, looked at his wife, then said it helped with the car purchase for Mia. He didn't specify how much, didn't volunteer details, just said it was part of the funding. Thomas slid a printed copy of the trust agreement across the table. It was maybe 20 pages, bound with a black clip, highlighted in sections. He pointed to a specific paragraph about asset disposition and asked if Dad understood what fiduciary duty meant. Dad's face went red. He started to argue, said this was a family matter, that it should have been handled internally, that bringing lawyers into it was making everything worse and more complicated than it needed to be. Thomas cut him off, politely but firmly. He said it stopped being just a family matter the moment the trust was involved. Said fiduciary duty isn't a suggestion or a guideline, it's a legal obligation. Trustees don't get to reinterpret the rules when it's convenient or when they think the original intent doesn't apply anymore. Then he laid out 2 options, clearly and without ambiguity. Option 1, voluntary restitution and compliance with oversight going forward. They could return the money, agree to formal management of the trust assets, and avoid a legal battle. Option 2, a formal challenge in court which would take longer, cost more for everyone involved, and likely result in the same outcome plus additional penalties and legal fees. Dad's wife looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and heavy, the kind of silence where you can hear people breathing. Then Dad asked what restitution meant specifically. Thomas explained in detail. The full amount from the watch sale, $15,000, would need to be restored to the trust within a reasonable timeline. If the watch itself could be located and repurchased, that would be the ideal outcome. If not, the cash equivalent would suffice. There would also be a formal agreement about how the house and other trust assets would be managed going forward, including regular accountings and oversight to prevent this from happening again. And if Dad and his wife chose to continue living in the house, which was also a trust asset, there would need to be a clear understanding about the arrangement, possibly including a temporary rent agreement to formalize it and a timeline for eventual transition. Dad's jaw tightened. He said, quietly but with an edge, that it wasn't fair, that he'd been managing the house and Grandpa's affairs for years without complaint, that he'd been the one handling everything while I was overseas. I spoke up then. My voice was steadier than I expected it to be. I said it wasn't fair that he sold something that wasn't his. It wasn't fair that he used my distance and Grandpa's trust to justify decisions he had no right to make. And it wasn't fair that he was making me the problem for telling the truth instead of acknowledging what he'd done wrong. He looked at me like I'd slapped him across the face, like I'd betrayed him instead of the other way around. Thomas asked if they needed time to consult their own attorney before responding to the terms. Dad's wife said quietly that they'd get back to him by the end of the week. The meeting ended. I didn't wait for them in the parking lot. I didn't try to smooth things over or apologize for the discomfort. I walked out of that building, got in my rental car, and drove back to my hotel. Once I was in the room, I sat on the bed and felt the exhaustion settle in like a weight I'd been carrying for miles. Not regret, not doubt, just the bone-deep tiredness that comes from doing something hard that needed to be done. A few days later, I met Grandpa at the nursing home. The timing felt important. I wanted to tell him in person what had happened, not compress it into a phone call where tone gets lost and details get skipped. He was in his usual spot by the window when I arrived, looking out at the parking lot and the trees beyond it. He asked before I'd even sat down if they listened. I said they heard me. Whether they actually listened, whether they understood why this mattered, was still the question. I told him about the meeting in detail, about Thomas laying out the facts with calm precision, no emotion, just documentation and legal terms, about the trust agreement being slid across the table like evidence in a courtroom, about the silence in the room when Dad realized this wasn't going to be smoothed over with apologies or promises to do better, about the look on Dad's face when the consequences became real and unavoidable, when he understood that this time there was a paper trail and legal backing and no way to talk his way out of it. Grandpa nodded slowly, taking it in. He said I did well, that standing up for what's right isn't cruelty, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when it costs you something, even when other people want to frame it as you being harsh or unforgiving. Then he told me something I wasn't expecting. He said I'd have options through the attorney now. The legal structure gave me leverage, real power to enforce consequences or allow for flexibility. How I used that leverage, he said, was up to me. I could be firm, holding every line and every deadline without exception. Or I could be generous, allowing for grace in the timeline if they showed genuine cooperation and understanding. But the choice, he emphasized, would be mine to make. I asked what he meant by that. He explained that the trust gave me a voice in how things moved forward from here. If Dad and his wife cooperated, fully returned what needed to be returned, showed they understood the seriousness of what had happened, stopped making excuses, I could decide whether to push for every consequence or to allow for some mercy in how things unfolded. But if they fought it, if they tried to delay or minimize or shift blame, The legal tools were there to enforce everything Thomas had outlined. The power was real, and it was mine to wield. I told him I didn't want to become like them. I didn't want to turn into someone who used power to hurt people or control them, even if I had the legal right to do it. He smiled a little when I said that. It was the kind of smile that comes from years of watching people wrestle with hard questions about integrity and power. He said, I wouldn't become like them, because I was asking that question in the first place. People who become cruel with power don't stop to worry about whether they're being cruel. Weeks passed after that conversation with Grandpa. The days had a strange quality to them. Waiting without urgency, consequences moving forward in the background without drama or spectacle. Dad called once during that time, his tone careful and measured in a way it had never been before. There was no bluster, no attempt to minimize what had happened. He asked about the timelines Thomas had set and whether there was any flexibility in the deadlines, whether I was willing to negotiate. I told him flexibility depended entirely on cooperation. If he followed through on what had been agreed to in the meeting, full documentation, full restitution, full transparency, then I wasn't interested in making things harder than they needed to be. But if he tried to delay, if he started renegotiating terms or making excuses, the deadlines would hold firm. Thomas would enforce them, and I would support that enforcement. He didn't argue. He just said, quietly, that he understood. It was the first time in my adult life I'd heard him accept something without pushback. Mia didn't reach out during that time, not once. I checked my messages more than I wanted to admit, half expecting an apology, or at least some kind of acknowledgement. An explanation maybe, or even just anger directed at me instead of silence. Nothing came. The absence of contact said more than words would have. Through Thomas, the paperwork kept moving forward with the steady inevitability of a machine that doesn't need emotion to function. Deadlines were set in writing and sent by a certified mail. The dealership where the car was purchased was contacted to verify the original purchase price, the financing terms if any, and the options for return or buyback. Documentation requests went out. Bank statements showing where the watch sale money had gone, receipts proving what had been purchased. Anything that would create a clear paper trail. I returned to Germany about a week after the meeting with Grandpa. I flew back on a military transport, the kind of flight that's all function and no comfort, and went back to my medic duties. Outward routine returned quickly. Shifts at the clinic, training exercises in the field, medical response drills that required focus and precision and left no room for distraction. But inwardly, something had shifted. There was a new steadiness in me, a sense that I'd done something I couldn't undo and didn't want to undo. I'd stood up when it mattered, and I'd done it without spite or cruelty. That counted for something. Justice doesn't always arrive with shouting or spectacle or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it arrives through paperwork and administrative processes, through consequences that build slowly and quietly and don't go away no matter how much someone might want them to. Sometimes justice is just the deadline that holds firm, and a lawyer who doesn't blink when people try to negotiate their way out of what they agreed to. Thomas called me shortly after I got back to Germany and settled into the rhythm of duty again. It was late afternoon there, evening where he was calling from. He said they'd agreed to the terms. Not happily, he clarified with characteristic precision, but fully. The pushback had stopped. The denials and minimizations had stopped. They'd signed the paperwork, and the signed documents were now in his office files. Restitution would restore the full amount from the watch sale, all $15,000, back into the trust. The timeline had been negotiated carefully, not because I was being soft or giving them an easy out, but because Thomas had recommended building in enough time for them to actually comply without creating built-in excuses for failure. Too short a timeline, he explained, and they could claim it was impossible to meet. Too long, and the urgency would fade and cooperation would slip. The deadline they agreed to was 90 days from the date of signing. 3 months to return the money or face formal legal action. A formal, temporary rent agreement was also established for the house. Since the house was legally a trust asset and they were living in it, the arrangement needed to be documented and formalized. The rent was set below market rate. Thomas had structured it that way deliberately to give them breathing room, to show that this wasn't about financial punishment, but it was real money, and it was binding, a legal obligation with a paper trail. Thomas called the whole arrangement generous. I called it fair. Fair didn't mean letting them off easy. It meant consequences that actually matched the breach without being vindictive. Then came the matter of the car. Mia fought returning it at first. Hard. There were multiple calls to Dad, conversations I only heard about secondhand through Thomas. Accusations that she was being punished for something she didn't do, for a decision Dad had made without her knowledge or consent. Claims that it wasn't fair to take away something she'd been using for months, something she'd come to depend on. Arguments about how much the car had depreciated in value, about whether there might be some other way to handle this. Maybe she could just pay back the difference over time. Maybe they could work out a payment plan. Maybe the car could stay and they'd find the money some other way. Thomas handled it all with the same calm precision he brought to everything. He explained, repeatedly and without irritation, that the car had been purchased with trust money, money that didn't belong to Dad or to Mia, money that belonged in the trust, protected for its intended purposes. The trust needed that money back. The car was the most direct mechanism for returning it, unless Mia happened to have $15,000 sitting in an account somewhere ready to transfer. She didn't. The arguments continued for a few days, then a week. Then they stopped. The resistance collapsed, not because anyone convinced Mia it was right, but because there wasn't a legal argument to support keeping the car. The facts were the facts. The return happened. The dealership, the same one where the car had been purchased originally, offered $87,000 as a buyback price. The original purchase price had been higher, closer to $95,000 according to the documentation Thomas had obtained, which meant there was a loss. Depreciation from months of use, wear on the interior. The reality that it was no longer brand new, the difference was about $8,000. I noted the loss when Thomas told me. It was significant, but so was the lesson. Sometimes getting consequences right means accepting that not everything can be made perfectly whole. Sometimes close enough is what justice looks like in the real world. Mia sent one message after the car was gone. It came through late at night my time, early evening hers. It said, "I didn't think it would end like this." I replied the next morning, "Neither did Grandpa. That's why he prepared." No response followed. I don't know if she understood what I meant, that Grandpa had set up the trust precisely because he'd seen the patterns, seen what might happen, seen that protection needed to be built in before it was needed, or if she was just done talking to me. Either way, the silence that came after her message felt different than the silence before it. Heavier, more final. Dad moved out of the house early, not using the full time the rent agreement had granted him. I heard about it through Thomas first. A brief professional update that the house would be vacant ahead of schedule, and then through a phone call from Dad himself a few days later. He and his wife had downsized to a small condo across town, 2 bedrooms, no yard, no garage for projects, no dining room large enough to host family gatherings. No space for the life they'd built or the identity that had come with it. The identity he'd constructed over the years as the host, the provider, the patriarch who made decisions and controlled the family narrative, all of that was gone now. Packed up and moved into storage, or donated to charity, or left behind for someone else to deal with. The house had been more than a place to live. It had been proof of status, of success, of being the person in charge. Without it, he was just a man in a small condo who'd made choices that had consequences. He called me from the new place a few days after they'd finished moving. His voice sounded tired in a way I'd never heard before. Not angry, tired, or frustrated, tired, just exhausted, worn down. He said he never thought I'd actually go through with this, that somewhere in the back of his mind he'd assumed I would back down eventually, that Grandpa would intervene and call it off, wanting to preserve family peace, that the whole thing would just fade away if he waited long enough and didn't take it too seriously. I said I didn't do this to him. I did it for myself, for the part of me that was tired of being invisible, tired of being told I didn't understand, that I wasn't here, that my perspective didn't matter, tired of watching promises get broken and being expected to stay quiet about it, to protect everyone's feelings except my own. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel him trying to decide what to say next, what admission might be safe to make. Then he said, quietly, almost under his breath, that he should have protected the watch, that he should have left it alone, should have found another way to help Mia if helping her was really what he'd wanted to do, should have asked Grandpa before making any decisions about trust property. I answered simply, without piling on, without listing every other thing he should have done differently over the years. I just said, yes, he should have. That was all I gave him. The truth, clean and direct. I let it sit there between us, uncommented on and undiluted. No softening, no reassurance that everything would be okay eventually, no rush to make him feel better about facing what he'd done. The conversation didn't last much longer after that. We said the kind of polite goodbyes people say when they don't know if they'll talk again soon or if they want to. Grandpa died in late April. A Red Cross message reached my unit while I was on shift, working through a routine medical screening for new arrivals. The notification came through official military channels, the kind of message that stops everything and reshapes your day in an instant. Emergency leave for immediate family death. I was cleared for travel within hours, paperwork processed faster than I'd ever seen it move. I flew home as soon as I could get a flight, but he was already gone by the time I landed. I'd known it was possible. The nursing staff had warned me his health was declining, that his heart was giving out in ways medicine couldn't reverse. But knowing something might happen doesn't soften the reality when it does. His room at the nursing home was peaceful when I went to see it one last time. Orderly. The bed was made with hospital corners. The chair by the window was empty but positioned exactly where he'd liked it. Personal effects had been packed into a small box by the staff. His reading glasses, a few books, the photos he'd kept on the nightstand. A nurse I recognized told me he'd passed quietly in his sleep during the early morning hours, that he hadn't been in pain, that he'd seemed at peace in the days leading up to it, calm in a way that felt like readiness rather than resignation. The funeral was modest but full. More people came than I'd expected. Former co-workers from the rail yard where he'd worked for 30 years, some of them elderly themselves now. Neighbors from the old house, the one he'd lived in before the nursing home. People from the church he'd attended for decades, faces I recognized from childhood visits. I stood at the front during the service, in a small chapel with wooden pews worn smooth from use, and afternoon light coming through plain glass windows that didn't try to be anything more than they were. I spoke briefly about Grandpa, about time and integrity, as things he'd lived rather than just talked about how he taught me that promises matter, that your word is something you either keep or you lose, and that how you spend your time tells the truth about what you actually value. I didn't mention the watch specifically, or the legal battle, or any of the family conflict. I didn't need to. The people who knew, knew. The people who didn't know, didn't need the burden of knowing. Afterward, as everyone was filing out and offering condolences, I didn't quite know how to receive. People squeezing my hand, saying he was proud of me, saying he talked about my service. Thomas met me outside the church. He was wearing a dark suit, the same calm professionalism he'd brought to every other setting. He handed me a small velvet box without ceremony or explanation, just placed it in my hands and waited. I opened it there on the church steps. Inside was the watch. Thomas explained quietly, keeping his voice low even though we were outside and alone. The trust had quietly and legally repurchased it once the restitution money had been fully restored. The dealership that had handled Mia's car had kept meticulous records of the original watch sale, including the name and contact information of the buyer, a private collector in the next state over who specialized in vintage timepieces. Thomas had reached out, explained the situation in general terms without going into family details, and the collector had been willing to sell it back. The price was reasonable, not cheap, but fair. Grandpa had made all the arrangements before he passed, knowing it might be possible to recover the watch, but never certain it would work out. He'd wanted to try. He'd wanted me to have it if it could be found. I held it in my hand there on the church steps and felt the weight of it, heavier than I remembered, or maybe I was just paying more attention now. The crystal still had those tiny scratches I recognized. The leather strap showed wear in the exact places I remembered. But the mechanism still worked. Time kept moving forward, steady and precise. History, promise, consequence, all of it held in one piece of steel and glass. I keep it mostly in my desk drawer now, wrapped in the same faded handkerchief Grandpa had used for decades, stored the way he'd stored it for years before he gave it to me. I wear it sometimes, on days that feel significant, on anniversaries of things that matter, on days when I need the physical reminder of what it means to keep your word even when it costs you something. But mostly I keep it safe, protected, waiting, the way it was always meant to be kept. Life didn't become perfect after that. Family dynamics don't reset overnight, and grief doesn't follow a schedule or respond to logic. There were days when I felt the absence of Grandpa like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, when I'd reach for my phone to call him before remembering he wasn't there to answer anymore. There were days when I wondered if I'd done the right thing, if standing up had been worth what it cost, if there might have been some other way to handle it all that would have hurt less and preserved more. But mostly there was a new steadiness in me, a sense that I'd chosen truth over comfort, chosen integrity over peace, and that the choice had mattered in ways I was still discovering. I'd learned that you can stand up for yourself without becoming cruel, that you can enforce consequences without turning into the kind of person who uses power to hurt people, that boundaries aren't the same as walls, and that saying no can be an act of love when saying yes would enable harm. Mia and I speak occasionally now, carefully. A text message on birthdays, a brief phone call around the holidays. We ask surface questions and give surface answers. There's no animosity, at least not that gets voiced out loud, but there's no pretending either. We're not close. We probably never will be, but we're civil, and sometimes in families like ours, civil is all you can realistically hope for. It's not the relationship I wish we had, but it's the relationship that's honest. I keep my distance from Dad, not as revenge, not as ongoing punishment, but as a boundary that finally exists and gets respected. We talk a few times a year, birthdays, major holidays, the occasional logistical update about family matters. The conversations are polite and surface level. He doesn't ask about my life in detail, and I don't offer more than basic facts. He doesn't bring up the trust or the watch or anything that happened. I don't push for apologies I'm not going to get. It's not the relationship I wish we had, but it's the relationship that's true. And truth, I've learned, matters more than comfort. I re-enlisted when my contract came up for renewal. It wasn't about running away from family or avoiding the complicated mess I'd left behind stateside. It was about choosing what I stand on. The military gave me structure, accountability, a clear mission that mattered. It gave me a place where effort and integrity still counted for something measurable, where promises weren't negotiable and consequences were applied equally. I still pray for my family. I pray that Dad finds peace with what he did and who he's become. I pray that Mia learns to build something on her own terms instead of waiting for someone else to provide it or rescue her. I pray for healing in places that feel too broken to fix, for wisdom I don't have on my own, for grace that I can't manufacture through willpower. But I don't confuse prayer with enabling anymore. I don't confuse love with silence or acceptance with complicity. Boundaries aren't the opposite of love, they're part of it. They're part of stewardship, part of protecting what matters without letting it be used against you or taken for granted or diminished by people who don't value it the way you do. Prayer doesn't mean I stop enforcing consequences or holding people accountable for their choices. It means I hold those consequences with a clear conscience, knowing I'm not acting out of spite or revenge or unexamined anger. If you're in a situation where the truth feels too risky to say out loud, where standing up means losing something you're not sure you can afford to lose, where family loyalty has become another word for silence, I'll tell you what I learned through all of this. Silence doesn't protect anyone. It just makes room for what shouldn't be happening. It enables the harm to continue and teaches the people who caused it that there are no real consequences for breaking their promises or violating trust. Boundaries aren't betrayal. They're the opposite. They're how you protect what's valuable in yourself, in your relationships, in the promises that were made to you that deserve to be kept. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And thank you for listening.